Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this year's Parkland Conference. My name is Jillian Pratt. I'm the president of the Non-Academic Staff Association, which is a union representing the support staff here at the University of Alberta. So today we're here for Myths as Reality, Alberta Politics, Society, and Democracy at a Crossroads. So over the course of the pandemic, the Common Grounds research team has engaged thousands of Albertans learning about their backgrounds, perspectives, and struggles. Through their surveys, focus groups, one thing has become abundantly clear. A gulf has emerged between who Albertans are as individuals and who they see themselves as a community. First from the team, we have Michelle Maroto. And Dr. Michelle Maroto is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Alberta and director for the Certificate in Applied Social Sciences Research. Her research interests include social stratification, gender and family, race and ethnicity, labor and credit markets, and disability studies. Her projects address the many dimensions of wealth, inequality, and the role of household structures in determining economic security and labor market outcomes for people with different types of disabilities. As a human ecology grad myself, which is very related to home economics, I'm particularly interested to hear this particular section of it because it fits some of my own personal interests as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Michelle. We have Dr. Feodor Snagovsky, who is an assistant professor at the University of Alberta. His work has focused on the comparative analysis of elections and political behavior, and particularly in the role that political elites play in shaping identity and public opinions. His current research examines the contours and impacts of white identity on political attitudes, behavior, and culture in Canada. His work has appeared in Party Politics, Electoral Studies, the Canadian Journal of Political Science, the Australian Journal of Political Science, Government and Opposition, and Parliamentary Affairs. And then last on the list, but not least for sure, we have Dr. Jared Wesley, who is a pracademic, I believe is the description, a practicing political scientist and former public servant, whose career path to the University of Alberta Department of Political Science has included senior management positions in the Alberta Public Service. As lead of the Common Ground Initiative, he studies the intersection of political culture, public opinion, and public policy. He is co-author of two leading books, The Public Servant's Guide to Government in Canada, University of Toronto Press, 2018, if anyone's looking to pick that up, and Inside Canadian Politics. Jared is a proud member of Alberta's Black Faculty Collective and a leader within the Black Youth Leadership and Mentorship Program in Edmonton. Let's give a warm welcome to our three speakers and panelists that we have here. Much of the session today is going to focus on the gulf between Albertans as individuals and who they see themselves as community, with this concept of myths as reality. I'm going to start this session by discussing some dimensions of social class within our broader theme. And for this talk, I'll first discuss myths and reality a little bit more generally. Then I'll review some of the data and methods behind our larger projects here. And then I'll also incorporate these data into a discussion of social class divides in Alberta. We could spend this entire talk discussing what's a myth and what's reality, and there's so many different perspectives on this. So to streamline things, I want to present a more general framework, give us an idea of how we're going to be thinking about myths and reality today. So myths are sometimes defined as untrue or false beliefs, which might lead us to set up a talk titled Myths versus Reality. In this case, you'll notice that instead we're focusing on myths as reality in this discussion today. Thinking of myths in this case, we're going to be thinking about them as more so narratives or potentially stories, which in this case is going to reflect a larger collective wisdom of a group or of society. In this case, myths can be attached to certain social meanings, they shape social life, and they can be used to validate or invalidate even different institutions or beliefs. So myths here can tell us how people see themselves and others, which affects what we actually see as reality. So in our case, we do acknowledge that reality is subjective, socially constructed, and context specific. However, there are still certain dimensions of social life and the larger social world that we can observe with different types of data as social scientists and as researchers. So this is what we're going to focus on as reality for this talk. And it leads us to a central question of how are myths linked to the observable dimensions of social life? So how do myths guide people's lives? How do they become reality? And where do they come from? So we're going to apply that to the case of Alberta today. Now, before I dig into the topic of my talk, I want to introduce some of the data that I'll be incorporating. For about 3 years now, our group has been working on studying different dimensions of life in Alberta and in Western Canada, with a specific focus on politics and communities. And for today's talk, I'm going to link some findings from different data sources that are part of this multi-method project. And Jared and Theo are also going to be bringing in a lot of these data in their talks today as well. So first we have data from the Common Ground focus groups, which include 42 focus groups at the moment, over 250 Albertans from 6 communities, which for what we'll be talking about today have taken place between November 2019 and August 2020, but they're also still ongoing. And these are generally centered around different types of activities to generate discussion. And they provide a general sense of political culture and what Albertans think about the province and the community. Second, I'll also be incorporating some data from the Alberta Viewpoint Survey. And at the moment, we've conducted 5 surveys with a sixth one planned. And the goal of these surveys is to gauge different aspects of public opinion and understand how Albertans are doing across different dimensions of social life. The specific data I'll be focusing on for today comes from the September 2021 survey. Now, finally, I also want to bring in some broader data from the Canadian Census and the Survey of Financial Security, which is going to allow us to make some comparisons across provinces as well. So we're going to look descriptively today and think about these 3 data sources and what they tell us about social class in Alberta. One of the broader myths surrounding social class in Canada and Alberta more generally regards this idea of everyone being middle class. And when given the option, most people living in Western capitalist countries place themselves towards the center of the distribution and often identify as middle class. So this is clear from a lot of research, but we also know that there's a lot that pushes us to say that we're middle class. Politicians love to talk about the middle class, although people are rarely able to define what middle class actually means. And in Canada, we even had a Minister of Middle Class Prosperity with a mandate to focus on growing the middle class and to ensure the prosperity and quality of life of the middle class are central to policy making. Now, this position only lasted a few years, but its existence still highlights the emphasis on making everybody middle class. So we know that middle class is an elastic concept, and it doesn't have a widely accepted definition. And in Alberta, I'll also argue that our understandings of social class get even a bit more complicated. We don't just hear rhetoric about the middle class, we also hear a lot about the working class, particularly in relation to some of the dominant industries here. And we know that energy constitutes a predominant economic sector in Alberta, and this results in large economic fluctuations that affect both unemployment and the occupational structure. And it also affects the attitudes and identities that are linked to social class, especially around class culture. So we see a lot of rhetoric related to working class culture and an emphasis on some of these dimensions. So I want to think about this a little bit more deeply and consider how social class is defined and how it's understood, and to go a bit beyond myths and think about how we can use data to understand social class. So what does it mean to be part of the middle class or the working class in Alberta? And answering these requires a bit of discussion around social class. What do I mean by social class? Well, this is actually a pretty messy concept. And here I actually want to take a moment to distinguish between what we think about as objective class position and subjective class identity. So class position refers to a person's objective class standing across dimensions that influence their life chances and various outcomes. So most often we connect these to things like employment, education, and income. Class identity, on the other hand, refers to a person's more subjective understandings of social class based on their relative assessment of different factors. So this shows more so where they fit into a specific hierarchy. Now, in this case, class identity also invokes notions of social closure, how people create boundaries, and where they think of themselves as falling within this larger hierarchy. And importantly, these measures do tend to be linked, but they don't perfectly overlap when we start to ask people to think about social class and discuss social class. So I also want to examine how these two concepts come together in people's lives as well. I'm going to use a few different data sources to think about this idea of social class and this idea of myths as reality and how they link together. So we want to think about, well, who might be this quintessential Albertan, and what do they think about poverty and wealth?
And importantly, how do Albertans draw boundaries around social class? So how do we think about social class identity and what factors might go into that? So I'm going to start with perceptions of social class related to the typical Albertan based on focus group data and activities where participants were asked to match certain statements with different groups. Now, what's interesting here is that instead of completing these activities based upon what they as individuals thought a person would say, respondents were asked to do so based on how they thought a typical Albertan would respond. Now, in most cases, the groups identified typical Albertans as being very much linked to working class white men with names like Joe and Steve and Tom and Dave. And I'll incorporate these in a few quotes here. So I'm going to start with a couple quotes about what Joe and Steve think about the wealthy and social class in Alberta. So from this first discussion and focus group, we have speaker 2 who says Joe might be wealthy. We don't know that. And the moderator, is this a sense that Joe considers himself to be wealthy, do you think? Well, speaker 2 says he could be on paper. Moderator responds, well, he could be on paper. And speaker 2 says, yeah, probably not. But he wouldn't identify as wealthy? No, he wouldn't. And following up on that a little bit later, speaker 3 also mentions, well, he's not middle class, he's disappearing. So respondents are telling us a little bit about how they think typical Albertans see themselves. Definitely not as wealthy, even though perhaps they might have the income to qualify. And this highlights some changes and concerns over potential declines with the working class in Alberta. Now, if we look at another focus group here, we get this quote in this particular case about Dave, who has active income, while the extremely wealthy have passive income. So we see some different dimensions here too about what people think about income and wealth and how those are connected. And finally, in one more quote about Steve here, the speaker says, yeah, Steve's a hard worker, pays taxes and contributes, and the wealthy don't seem to care about the average middle income people or lower income, right? And they need to understand that maybe they need to help more. So in this case, this description of Steve further describes the disconnect between the wealthy and everyone else. So we get some evidence that there are potentially social class divides here, particularly in terms of how people think about the wealthy in Alberta. Now, we can go on with this a little bit and think about something very interesting here, because when asked to describe where the wealthy live, most participants located them as outside Alberta. So for instance, multiple focus groups describe them as living in cities such as Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal. And some people would place wealth in Calgary, but that was less often than people thinking about the wealthy as being outside of Alberta. Now, what does this actually mean if we think about income and wealth across provinces? If we want to compare these perceptions to reality, we have a lot of data that tell us where the wealthy actually live in Canada. Now, unfortunately, census data are coming out at a bit of a trickle right now, so I can't quite answer where the wealthy live based upon income and proportions across different provinces. However, we can still make some comparisons about how wealthy people are in different provinces by comparing the median income and the median wealth across provinces. So this first graph on the left here plots the median household after-tax income for 2020 across provinces, and the graph on the right shows the results for net worth, or general measure of wealth. So we can see that if we take a look over here at median household income, Alberta ranks at the top in this particular case. However, they're much closer to the middle, a little bit further down in terms of household net worth, particularly because this ranking is very much associated with housing prices. So we can look at income and wealth across provinces, and we can also look across different census metropolitan areas. If we do the same thing for our CMAs, we get somewhat different rankings. Calgary, again, at the top for median household income over here. But in this case, if we look over here, Calgary and even Edmonton are much lower down in terms of median household net worth. So I think we can start to see that perhaps how we describe and measure and understand social class can really matter for what we think of where the wealthy are across the country. What we also want to think about here is social class identity, though, and how people see themselves as falling within this hierarchy. So is everyone working class or potentially middle class in this context? Well, we can actually use some data here from the Alberta Viewpoint Survey to think about how Albertans rank themselves in terms of social class identity. Now, this figure comes from the September 2021 data, And it's giving us the percentage of respondents who identified with each of the 5 social class identity categories. Now, like most other studies, the majority of Albertans rank themselves as being middle class, followed by 20% as working class and 20% as lower middle class, with further smaller percentages at the end of the distribution. So despite describing the typical Albertan as being working class, most still identify as middle class, like most other provinces around the rest of Canada. So that tells us how people identify. Now, as a final step, I want to think about how this identity might be linked to other measures of class position, particularly employment, income, insecurity, and education. So that takes us to our next slide here, where we can look at social class position and identity. Do people consider their positions in terms of education and income and employment when they think about social class? So to answer this question, I'm presenting some results across broader models that control for a variety of other factors. And this first figure over here is giving us the predicted probability of indicating membership in these different class categories based upon levels of income in this graph over here, and then levels related to economic security, particularly how easy or hard it was for people to meet their expenses in the past week. So what we see here is that income showed an especially strong relationship with class identity. The percentages as identifying as middle class were highest among these income categories here, closer to the middle. And we see a much higher percentage of upper middle class people linked to higher incomes. If we look at economic insecurity, we also see that the individuals who had the easiest time meeting their expenses were also more likely to identify as upper middle class. So we see some linkages between how people think of class in relation to income and insecurity. And finally, we can see some linkages in terms of education and employment, but a little bit less so, which I think is really interesting. I have the same graphs up here for you, where over on the left, we have education ranging from a high school degree up to a graduate or professional degree, and employment status related to employment full-time, so being not in the labor force here. Now, in this case, what's interesting with education is it didn't show that strong of a relationship. If you look across education categories, most people, regardless of their education level, are identifying as middle class. In terms of employment, though, this is where we see the working class come in a little bit more, where we particularly see that if someone's going to identify as working class, the second lightest green here, they're definitely going to be more likely employed full-time or part-time. So we can start to see that perhaps when people think about working class, they're also connecting it to occupation as well. So what does this all mean for us today? Well, today I brought in data from a few different sources to discuss myths as realities around social class in Alberta. And this involved looking at people's assumptions of what a typical Albertan is, where Alberta fits within the income and the wealth distribution in comparison to other provinces, and how Albertans perceive their own social class membership. Now, when focus group respondents were asked to describe the typical Albertan, they most often described a working class person, often emphasizing people who are employed in the oil sands. And they also tended to see the wealthy as living outside of Alberta. Census data, however, show that median incomes in Alberta are pretty high compared to other provinces. And our Viewpoint Alberta survey data also showed that most residents of Alberta identify as middle class, followed by categories of working class and lower class. And though if we look at a little bit more expansive data on net worth, we can start to see some linkages to reality in this case, where wealth tends to be higher in provinces outside of Alberta as well. And finally, in terms of how subjective class identity can be linked to these different objective class positions, we see some overlap, but that correlation is far from perfect. So people aren't exactly saying my income's exactly this, and I fall in this category here. So overall, what is myth and what is reality is pretty murky. These dynamics overlap, they influence one another. And getting at the links between those really requires incorporating multiple types of data and understanding how people view their own statuses, such as those linked to social class, where they perceive themselves within hierarchies, and how they see others as well. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions later on.
Definitely a lot of food for thought on that one. And if you can join me in welcoming our next presenter up, we have Dr. Feodor Snagovsky.
Today we're talking about one of my favorite topics in the last few months, which is the Freedom Convoy, and how much Albertans support the Freedom Convoy in particular. If you follow the news, as I imagine most folks in this room do, I think the impression that you come away with is that Albertans, more than any other province, overwhelmingly support the Freedom Convoy. And when I say the Freedom Convoy, of course, I'm referring to the occupation of downtown Ottawa back in February of 2022, as well as the Coots border crossing and the series of protests that came in many cities. You saw many headlines around the time of the original protests in February, how Albertans were protesting in the streets. You saw news about how police officers were leaving their posts because they were sympathetic to the Freedom Convoy. So if you were following most coverage of the event, you would come away with the impression that we live in a province where the Freedom Convoy is very popular. And indeed, you also got that impression from looking at our political elites, our representatives, the people who make decisions on our behalf. You had folks like Casey Madhu thanking the Freedom Convoy for mobilizing against Ottawa's tyrannical policies. You had a local MP from Edmonton talking about how the Freedom Convoy is a really good thing and showing up in support at the downtown Ottawa protests. So if you looked at the coverage of the people in Alberta and the political elites in Alberta, you would come away with this impression that this is a really powerful force that everybody supports. By the way, this hasn't disappeared, right? Particularly as the inquiry for the Emergencies Act has continued, you still see lots of key details emerging, like how a pastor told folks that they should be willing to die for their freedom down in Coots when the original protests down there were going on, how hundreds of folks showed up at a Lethbridge courthouse to protest and support those arrested following the Coots border blockade. So it's not like this was a flash in the pan. This is still, these articles are from this month. I think you know where this is going. The punchline here is not going to be terribly surprising to you. The popular perception is that Alberta is a hotbed of Freedom Convoy support, that we live in a province where this is really the mainstream narrative. The reality is that most Albertans opposed both the Freedom Convoy's goals and methods. While that may not be surprising based on the way I've sort of led you to this point, there are some really interesting differences between who does support the convoy and potentially why. And this is where the theme of myths as reality starts to take effect, because the myths that we construct for ourselves about who supports which movements end up shaping our realities and the way political elites behave after the events take place and as they try to seek re-election. The data that I'm using come from, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because my colleague Dr. Maroto outlined this in great clarity. These data come from the April 2022 wave of the Viewpoint Alberta survey. So this was just after the Freedom Convoy originally happened, but long enough after that people sort of had time to pause and reflect and step back and say, okay, what are we really thinking about here? What do we support or oppose what was happening? Created in the survey literature was known as an index. So we asked a whole bunch of questions in this survey about people's support for various elements, whether it was the protesters that were doing the right thing, whether they were achieving those things was correct, whether they supported the objectives of the convoy, what those objectives were. And we found that only about 4.1 out of 10, that was the average scale for support of the Freedom Convoy's objectives. That is to say, the average level of support for the Freedom Convoy in Alberta was about at a 4 out of 10. It dropped precipitously as you started to look at the methods the convoy employed. You did have folks in Alberta who were particularly displeased with the amount of public health restrictions going on at the time, and from that perspective supported what the protesters were setting out to achieve. The way they were setting out to achieve them by occupying downtown Ottawa, by occupying border crossings, that had much less support than the objectives. Even less, barely detectable number of Albertans actually did anything, one way or the other. That's important to note. So the action scale was both speaking out or sending out petitions or posting on social media, both in support or in opposition to the convoy. So very few people actually did anything to voice their support or opposition. So what this tells us is that quite frankly, when people put up polling information about people's support for various things, you should be a little bit skeptical. Because if you put up a polling question about the Treaty of Algernon from Star Trek and whether you support the Treaty of Algernon, you're going to get a surprising number of people who agree with you. Where you really want to pay attention is on stuff like this. Most Albertans sort of let it pass them by. It was sort of a thing that they observed, but didn't really pay too much attention about. There were some really interesting differences, though, when you split this up into groups. This is a big, overwhelming figure, and I'm going to go down each of these things in a little bit more detail, starting from gender and race. The differences between men and women in support for the Freedom Convoy's objectives were almost non-existent. This might come as a surprise to some of you, because I think the popular perception is that the Freedom Convoy was a very male-dominated event. When we saw folks protesting in the border crossings, when we saw folks occupying downtown Ottawa, they were mostly men who were doing it. There's a lot of reporting at the time about how the overwhelmingly toxically masculine environment in downtown Ottawa was making a lot of women in Ottawa feel quite unsafe. So when we think of radical right or far right protest movements, we tend to associate those with men, and that's not what we found at all. And indeed, the literature shows this as well, that there's a lot of women, just as there are men, who support these kinds of protest movements. There were considerably more differences between white and non-white respondents. Now, the reason we don't separate non-white into any more detail is because of survey limitations. We have a somewhat small sample of people, so we simply don't have enough respondents to differentiate between various subgroups of BIPOC folks. But we did observe differences between BIPOC and white respondents, in that, probably not surprisingly, white folks supported the convoy much more than non-white folks. And indeed, some research that we're working on right now is looking at the intersection of white identity and support for the Freedom Convoy as it was taking place. So stay tuned for some of that. There were differences as well between income and education in support, different groups based on income and education for support for the convoy's objectives. Basically, if you were university educated, you were much less likely to support the Freedom Convoy's objectives. If you belonged to any other group, you were no more or less likely. So between folks who had a high school education or less, some college or university or a trade certificate, the differences were very, very small compared to the differences between those folks and folks with a university degree. As well, the income effects were sort of counterintuitive, or maybe not quite as you would expect. You saw the highest support for the Freedom Convoy's objectives among folks who were making about $40,000 or less a year. And that declined as you got to about 120,000, and then it jumped up back again for folks making more than 120,000. It jumped up to where folks making the 60 to 70,000 range were, so it wasn't a huge jump back up to that first income group. But it's not quite a linear relationship that the more you make, the less supportive of the convoy's objective you were. And this goes back to what Dr. Maroto was talking about in terms of class. This idea that class membership affects how people see movements. And this definitely supports the idea that for some folks, the Freedom Convoy was a working class protest, that it was based on a group of people who felt that their interests were not being represented, probably for a whole number of reasons, besides the fact that truckers couldn't cross the border. Here's where things start to get more interesting, as far as Alberta is concerned. Really, really big differences between urban, suburban on the one hand, and rural folks on the other. Now, this probably won't come as a shock to many of you, but when you visualize this according to region, you can see where that actually materializes. You see in this top group here, the north, that number is 60%. Right? So 60% of folks north of Edmonton, or North Public Health Group, supported the Freedom Convoy's objective. Pretty strong majority. But if you look at Edmonton and Calgary, Edmonton around 33, Calgary at 37, this definitely pushes back against the notion, well, I mean, Edmonton is not going to surprise you, pretty liberal place as far as Alberta is concerned, but Calgary as well. Now, we tend to think of Calgary as being associated with big business and oil, and it really isn't. You know, a lot of folks in Calgary thought the Freedom Convoy was not a good thing at all. If you look here at Central and South, so looking at places like Red Deer or Lethbridge, support for the Freedom Convoy increased again, right? So this contextualizes these differences between urban and suburban folks on the one hand and rural folks on the other. That really, since much of what the Freedom Convoy was trying to do was to protest public health restrictions, and since those restrictions were the least popular in rural places to begin with, it shouldn't come as a surprise that those folks were the same people who were in favor of what the Freedom Convoy was doing. Where that becomes more interesting, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that the way the Freedom Convoy tried to achieve these things. I mean, the Freedom Convoy was not a movement in which people raised helium balloons with stuffed teddy bears and were shouting "Kumbaya," right? This was fundamentally, in some ways, a threat to democracy, right? These were folks who were walking along in front of the Parliament building in Ottawa, talking about how the government needs to be overthrown. They were, I mean, certainly not everybody, and it is extremely, extremely difficult, important to stress, to contextualize everybody's motivations as uniform or anything approaching uniform in that movement. But even a movement like that garnered quite a lot of support because the people who supported its underlying goals had seen that transfer over to what they were doing. Where I'm going to spend most of my time talking for the rest of this session here is about partisanship. Now, partisanship is a really important element of political life in Canada. It's the key cleavage between people's political lives in most countries, but in Canada here is no exception. And we saw here how partisanship broke up according to the three main federal political parties, the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the NDP. You saw that Liberal supporters and NDP supporters overwhelmingly thought the convoy shouldn't be taking place. They did not support the convoy's objectives. But more than half of Conservative respondents, folks that identify with the Conservative Party of Canada, did support the Freedom Convoy's objectives. Now, folks on the right tend to be less supportive of public health restrictions, not surprising there. But why this matters so much is that this is also the narrative, right? This was the myth. This was how people in Alberta, people across Canada, saw the Freedom Convoy as folks supporting Pierre Poilievre, folks supporting Maxime Bernier of the People's Party of Canada. This was the perception of that coalition. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to you when we further dissociate the results. You have the provincial parties as well, the United Conservative Party and the NDP in blue and orange respectively, green as an other, and yellow as none of the above. You saw similar effects taking place. And this set the stage for the UCP leadership race. Danielle Smith ultimately inherited a party which saw, of the people who strongly supported the Freedom Convoy's objectives, more than half, 57%, identified with the UCP. Among people who only somewhat supported the convoy's objectives, the numbers were similarly high at around half, 49.5%. And the cleavages were exactly the same on the other side. So you have among people who strongly oppose and somewhat oppose, but primarily strongly oppose the Freedom Convoy, an overwhelming plurality supported the NDP. So these narratives help construct coalitions that political elites, that representatives have in their minds as they're constructing policy proposals, as they're going to elections, as they're trying to win internal leaderships. We were doing this before Pierre Poilievre had officially taken over as the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. And his two main challengers ideologically were Jean Charest and Patrick Brown. Among Albertans and conservative identifying Albertans, how they were planning to vote in the leadership of who they supported varied dramatically based on where they placed themselves on support for the Freedom Convoy. So we saw here among folks that in the general population of Alberta who supported the convoy's objectives, 68%, 2/3, preferred Pierre Poilievre over Charest or Brown. Among those who opposed the convoy's objectives, Charest and Brown were much more popular. And again, this was a majority of people. This is the bigger group compared to this one. So among this group of people who are actually opposed to the convoy's objectives, more people in the general population of Alberta would have preferred Jean Charest or Patrick Brown. That's an interesting thing to think about as the next federal election approaches in a couple of years. However, if you look at the conservative base, you see something quite different. Among both groups, who supported and opposed the convoy, both groups preferred Pierre Poilievre. So this explains, at least in part, why he ultimately won. Right? Among the conservative base, at least in Alberta, both sides of the convoy debate supported Pierre Poilievre, but among the people who supported the convoy more strongly, Pierre Poilievre too was more popular. You can break this down another way by flipping the denominator. So among the Pierre Poilievre coalition, people who ultimately supported Pierre Poilievre, 2/3, 67%, supported the convoy's objectives. Among people who were supporting Jean Charest and Patrick Brown, that number was only about 22%. This was a key flashpoint issue that helped create the coalitions that these political elites have in the backs of their minds as they're going out to win these party leaderships and contest general elections. The last couple of things I wanted to mention here is that one dimension in which the Freedom Convoy continues to be really important is in social polarization. Now, one of the sets of batteries we asked in this survey was about how you feel when you see people masked and not masked going out about their day, going to the grocery store, in the classroom, etc. So among people who were pro-mask themselves, who were maskers, who identified as maskers, we asked if people felt angry when they saw people without a mask, glad when they saw people wearing masks, and whether they agreed with the statement that non-maskers are stupid. We asked the same set of questions to people who did not wear masks, who don't wear masks. So, are you angry when you see people in a mask? Are you glad when you see someone without a mask? And do you think that maskers are stupid? And this split up along the Freedom Convoy support exactly as you'd expect. If you supported the Freedom Convoy, you were much more likely to think that maskers are stupid. You were much more likely to say that you were glad when you saw someone not wearing a mask, and you were much more likely to be angry when you saw someone wearing a mask. These are the dimensions in which we go about our day-to-day lives and see people wearing some of their political opinions, in a sense, on their faces. These political movements shape how we see each other, in addition to how political elites see us. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but one thing we also examined was how people who supported and opposed the convoy, what kind of media they watched and what kind of media they trusted. The results here aren't surprising. If you supported the Freedom Convoy, its objectives, you were much less likely to consume the CBC or trust the CBC or CNN or CTV or Global News, any of the mainstream outlets, but places like Fox News, Rebel News, and the Western Standard got much more of your attention. In conclusion, most Albertans really did not support the Freedom Convoy's objectives or methods, and the vast majority didn't take action one way or the other. That said, convoy support varied dramatically according to these key demographic and political groups. In my view, the Freedom Convoy is going to have lingering and important effects for the polarization of our society and our information ecosystem. And with that, I'm going to cede to my colleague, Dr. Jared Wesley. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to focus on the widespread sense that Albertans are internally divided and externally divided from the rest of Canada. So those are the two myths that we're going to explore here. We've already heard of when our various surveys have taken place. I would say some of these findings and suggestions that I'm going to provide today are actually drawn from our most recent wave of focus groups in August or earlier this year. The three contestable propositions about Albertans that I'm going to put before you today are, first, that Albertans are alienated from the rest of Canada, and you'll find in some ways they are, but in other ways they're not. Second, that Albertans are autonomous. In other words, they want more of what Quebec has, for lack of a better term. They want to build a firewall around the province and to pursue their own sovereignty, as some elites have suggested. And the third one that I'm going to contest here a little bit, despite what we heard from Dr. Snagovsky a second ago, is this notion that Albertans are internally polarized. Let's start with this question of whether Albertans are actually alienated. Where does this myth come from? Well, It's been around for many years. I actually show this famous milch cow cartoon that many people have seen, where the cow is being fed in the West, being milked in central Canada, and as Tommy Douglas famously put it, God knows what it's doing in the Maritimes. This notion, this cartoon dates back, I think this particular one, back to the Grain Growers Guide in 1915, but we've seen various different versions of it over time through the 1960s. This notion that Alberta is being exploited by central Canada is nothing new, and when we show our focus group participants cartoons like that, they'll tell you that Joe, the typical Albertan, identifies with that still to this day. What's a little bit different now is from our polling, and maybe it's just because we have the polling, but I suggest there is a bit of a generational change here. People are not just feeling a sense of being held back by the rest of Canada, but there's a sense, at least in elite rhetoric, if not in public opinion, that Albertans are being held back and falling behind the rest of Canada. And this notion of status loss is something that American political scientists have been studying for many years. And if you think about it, this perceived loss of status exists on many levels. It exists at the state level, that Alberta is falling behind other parts of Canada. This is particularly a poignant point made during the last economic downturn, less salient now because the reality that we see in front of us does not bear that out. At the community level, we're also seeing it though, and we do focus groups in places like Fort Mac and Hanna, for example, where those communities are not what they used to be or don't feel like they are what they used to be, or they're worried that they will be in longer term decline. But as I'll show you as well, that status loss or perceived loss of status vis-a-vis other people is also felt at the individual level, particularly among folks that are closely connected to the oil and gas industries. Are Albertans actually alienated? Yeah, I'd say they're jilted, right? When we ask the standard questions like this, in general, the federal government treats my province worse, province isn't treated with respect, province receives less of its fair share, less than its fair share. Those types of questions will show that the majority, supermajority of Albertans feel jilted in that way. But that's not necessarily reflected in feelings of anger, right? So when we started polling in November 2019, you have to remember this is a time when Albertans sent all of their MPs to the House of Commons to sit in the opposition benches. Separatism was spiking in the province. People were ticked. They were ticked that they weren't being heard in the rest of Confederation. But that angriness has dissipated considerably over time, and feelings of contentment, excitement, and optimism have increased over time. Now, that might be closely connected to the economy. I suggest it probably is. But I think it's a bit of a myth that Albertans are angry. How about when we ask the question, are our best days behind us? And we have this data when it comes to Alberta. We asked our respondents, do you think Alberta's best days are behind it? We can see that around half of Albertans consistently over our survey periods have felt like Alberta's best days are behind it, but a substantive drop in our most recent survey in April of 2022. Again, probably connected closely with the economy. When we asked them that question about whether Canada's best days are behind it, we started asking that question in 2021, we see an uptick. There's a sense of more pessimism when it comes to national politics or Canada's future than it is in terms of Alberta's future. And as actually Albertans are a bit more bullish about their own local community's future than they are about their provincial or federal or national community. But this is the one I'd like to examine more in future surveys and in our focus groups, because there is a real sense at the individual level when we ask Albertans, do you feel like people like you are falling behind in society? That number is increasing. When you add all of these things together, folks, it's time to start at least questioning whether Alberta is the Texas of the North, or whether certain parts of Alberta are starting to feel like they are the Rust Belt of the North, or the coal country of the North. Because these types of indicators appeared in parts of the United States where dominant industries were in decline. They also appeared in the industrial heartland in the United Kingdom as well, which led, as we all know, to Trumpism and Brexit, respectively. So we'll keep an eye on that. Secondly, are Albertans autonomous? Do they want to build a firewall around Alberta? You don't have to go back too far in our history when the West wants in was the big mantra, right? That was the Reform Party mantra at the time. Stephen Harper campaigned on that as a Reform Party MP here in this province, and then soon became co-author of the famous Firewall Letter, which had advocated for things, among other things, creating our own pension plan, our own police force, and our own revenue collection agency. Again, all of those ideas have come to the fore. Again, memes like this have started to circulate, suggesting perhaps that Albertans are in the mood, or should be in the mood, to build that firewall. Cartoonists have picked up on this as well. Jason Kenney with his Fair Deal plan and junket was suggesting he was going to build a firewall around Alberta. And of course, this is most recently reflected in Danielle Smith's push for a Sovereignty Act. Does this sentiment play out in public opinion? No, absolutely not. There's only a very small proportion of Albertans that believe are in the mood to build this firewall around Alberta. We measure a bunch of different policy prescriptions that are designed to assuage Albertans' feelings of alienation, and we arrayed them on the y-axis here in terms of the level of importance people place on that policy solution. How important do you think it is for the government to pursue that particular policy? Along the x-axis here is level of support. How much do you support that particular policy initiative? So anything in this quadrant here are things that people are bullish about and they think the government of Alberta should pursue. Largely, these are bridge building activities. The notion that we should get more federal jobs in the West. The notion that we should have Senate reform. We need freer internal trade. The bottom quadrant here, people don't think it's very important at all for the government to pursue, and they don't really support it, are those three firewall measures. Support for leaving the Canada Pension Plan, ditching the RCMP, and creating your own revenue agency. And this is consistent. This is drawn from April 2022. I could put up the same graph. It's almost identical across time throughout our surveys. And we see that the level of support for withdrawing from the CPP, for example, is at about 25%. Opposition is 57%. And if you track across here, which you can do with your own eyes, those opinions are hardening. We're seeing a hollowing out of the neutral position. People are actually hardening in their opposition to these three measures. We don't have time to go in today about the equalization referendum. Just passed our anniversary for the equalization referendum, so happy Constitutional Referendum Day. I don't know what you want to call it. But we can see here that clearly opposition to those three measures are very weak, and that if this government wants to move forward with them, they've got a lot of salesmanship to do in order to make them popular. We did track separatism. That's declined substantially over time as well. You can see our website for more papers on who exactly does support separatism. It's a very small group of people, mostly confined to the same groups that Dr. Snagovsky talked about in terms of Freedom Convoy support. So separatism, as much attention as people are giving it, is actually still a minority position within Alberta, which I think is good news for those folks that value national unity. What explains all of this? Albertans don't consider themselves to be Albertans first. Albertans consider themselves to be Albertan and Canadian. And like anybody who has multiple identities, we all have multiple identities, really the one that jumps to the fore is really dependent on context. When I saw during the UCP leadership campaign a number of contenders trying to suggest that Albertans are Albertans first, or we're going to put Alberta first, that's not a message that's going to resonate with a lot of people in this province. So I'm actually going to leave it there. And I'll tease you with the notion of whether Albertans are polarized or not ideologically. And if people have questions about that, I can run through real quick. Thanks.
We were looking at a lot of data about individuals, and then you started talking about community. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more about that. What the data reflects to their local community. You just started to hint it of like, okay, Albertans feel that they're Albertans and they're Canadians, but are they feeling within that local community, or do you see that individualization, polarization, alienation within their local community? Thank you.
Albertans feel most attached to their country and to their province, less to their region and less to their local communities. It really is context dependent. The positioning of that question in the survey is really important. We asked a bunch of questions about federal and provincial voting behavior, and then we asked them how attached are you to Canada and the province. They're already primed to be thinking about that in terms of their identity. It's really tough to tell. What I can tell you is don't force people to choose. They get mighty upset in our focus groups when you truly push them to ask them, does Joe put Alberta first? And people go, well, when, right? I mean, if Joe is going to the Calgary Flames versus Edmonton Oilers game, no, it's a city. It's a city mentality that he's taken to that game. It's not a provincial one. So I'm very iffy about talking about ranking identities. I think that people have attachments to a lot of them.
What were the objectives of the Freedom Convoy?
I think people had different thoughts on that, both within the protests themselves and within the general electorate here in Alberta. If you asked most people, it would be to get rid of most COVID restrictions. I asked my students in the classroom, do you think the convoy succeeded? You know, did they get their objectives met, or was it just very good timing? The restrictions were mostly on their way out anyway when the convoy was taking place, and they continued well past most of them were gone. In some ways, to answer your question more directly, the convoy was about truckers, cross-border mandates, and COVID restrictions. But in many other ways, it was, I think, a backlash against the federal government, and particularly Justin Trudeau, as embodying the federal Liberals. We're going back into the field in a few months in January to revisit the group of people who were supporters of the Freedom Convoy back in April, to see how their opinions have changed. So it'll be very fascinating to ask them what they thought a year down the convoy was trying to achieve.
I'm hearing a lot of privilege in who I am and what's my rights and stuff like that. And I'm curious about how Indigenous peoples were fit into these demographics. Many people may not agree, but Canada is not a country, it's a corporation. The sovereignty is actually, the first law of the land is the Indigenous law. It should be, but it's not. It's not talked about, it's not practiced, but the sovereign law of this land is Indigenous law. But I have a question for Feodor. You use the word BIPOC, and I would like to understand what your feelings about that acronym is. When you're talking people of color, I thought black would be included with that, and why is black put ahead of Indigenous peoples in that acronym? That's my point.
With regards to the acronym, I certainly didn't mean anything by it. It was sort of a term that I hear encountered a lot in the popular narrative. I think when constructing acronyms, at least I would guess, most people try to go for pronounceability. I don't think it was a hierarchy in that sense, but it's not my term, and I certainly didn't mean anything by it.
We've also, as a research team, really struggled with this, and as someone who identifies as black, I don't identify as BIPOC. So what we're struggle with as researchers is using terms that aren't imposing an identity on people who don't share that identity. And I just got back from Ottawa where I spent 3 days talking about this, and we haven't resolved it. The challenge with our data, as Fio mentioned, is that we have so few folks in the ethnic and identity communities that are not white. It's tough for us to report them without skewing your idea of what those folks feel. It's a constant challenge that we encounter, and I don't think we're going to solve it anytime soon. It really comes down to using more qualitative data like we're doing in the focus groups, but it is really tough. So I share your frustration with it.
In your data,
Yep.
those $120,000 are supporting the Freedom Convoy, and the data is high, compared to even some of the lower earners. My own assumption would be those earning that kind of money will be CEOs and captain of industry. So why are we having that kind of high statistics among those earners?
And I think that gets back to the whole topic of our discussion for today around myths as realities, where we have these assumptions about social class, and we also expect more working class people to be supporting things like the Freedom Convoy or being more conservative. When we actually look at political preferences and identity and support for these things, it doesn't line up that way. So I think there is even a much more greater support among wealthy individuals for things like that we don't often talk about. And I think that's partially putting our assumptions and that data together.
Just a quick question about gender. It surprised me, the results on the support for the Freedom Convoy, especially in light of, the fairly significant gender gap in voting intentions right now. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about gender.
Well, the gender gap has actually disappeared in voting intention. Oh, yes. It's interesting because it used to be not just 2019, the UCP had erased the gender gap and men and women were equally likely to vote for them, and now it's gone the other way. So in our April 22 survey, that was what amazed me, is that the New Democrats in our most recent survey had polled well among both men and women and erased the gap.
On the question of gender and voting behavior, there's a really interesting literature on how, now we tend to think of the modern gender gap as women being more left-wing, tending to vote for more left-wing parties. And in fact, 30 or 40 years ago, it was exactly the opposite. when women overwhelmingly supported center-right party because they were seen as more promoting traditional family values. So it's interesting how gender gaps change and evolve over time as issues and identities change. With regards to the Freedom Convoy, I mean, I would characterize it, I don't know if my colleagues would agree, I would characterize the Freedom Convoy as a far-right movement. And there's an interesting literature on people who support the far right. In the international sense, there is a gender gap among far-right support, but it's not as big as you think. Lots and lots and lots of women support the far right.
Is there polarization in Alberta?
It's partisan polarization. It's not naturally occurring in the electorate. If you arrayed Albertans on a traditional left-right spectrum, left, right, and you showed the distribution of folks who place themselves on that spectrum, you've got almost a natural curve, with the mean position being 5.2 out of 10, just barely to the right of center. And most Albertans, 40% of them, place themselves right in the middle. It's only when you add party identification that you start to see the bimodal distribution, those two humps that you're used to seeing when it comes to polarization. So a lot of this is not ideological, it's being driven by partisanship, which we'll be investigating through the lens of identity now, because I think there's an in-group mentality, but more than that, an out-group animosity that's built up between people who support the New Democrats on one hand that have an animosity towards the UCP and vice versa. It's not that the parties are appealing to an electorate that is bimodally distributed with a clump on the left and a clump on the right. Albertans are naturally distributed. It's only when you start to parse them out by party that you see those two camel humps.
The data on the population level are very clear that at the moment there is very little polarization ideologically between left and right among the Alberta electorate. Where I think there is polarization, as Dr. Wesley mentioned, is among political parties. But importantly, polarization, we tend to think of polarization in a US context, where Democrats and Republicans are evenly split. That is not the only way for polarization to take place, right? There's nothing about that that says groups have to be equal in size. So if there's a growing part of the electorate that has the potential to consume their own news, trust their own sources, that is polarization, that even if the groups are not equally distributed. So I guess what I would say is there is a lot of reason to be cautious and not to take for granted that we live in a society where people get along and mostly agree on most things.
You talk about the myths, and then there's conspiracy theories. People kind of have them in the same category, at least I did. What I'm wondering is how do we educate those that are in the conspiracy theory area things, especially now with the way that education has become so expensive. Middle class people can't afford it. It's becoming so impossible to afford the education that we can't teach people what the difference is between the reality, the myths, and the conspiracy theories and all that. So how do we teach that so people can learn it? They can't afford to go to school.
Those are two great points and big issues for right now, right? Misinformation and increasing costs of education. I don't have the full answer here. I think thinking more broadly, though, and instead of just saying conspiracy theories, thinking more broadly like we are in terms of myths, stories, and narratives that affect people might be a start. I think there are divisions in terms of some of us saying, well, you believe in these conspiracy theories, you're out there, you're wrong. And having that better conversation can be a start. In terms of funding education, I mean, my answer is always going to be, let's tax the rich, but that is also another story,
So if I can just add on to that, on the point about conspiracy theories, I teach a course about that. I have a couple thoughts. The TLDR version is that we often think about education as a euphemism for intelligence. I certainly did, before I started researching some of this stuff. If we could only get people more, and I don't mean to, I'm not saying this is you, but often when we talk about saying we need to get people more educated so they won't believe conspiracy theories, what we really want to say is that people are stupid and we should educate them to make them less stupid. And what you find, in fact, is that people who subscribe to conspiracy theories have higher levels of political knowledge than the general population. These are not people who are out there and they lack the basic skills to follow a political conversation. They're actually usually highly motivated and highly skilled to make the leaps that they are making. The solution isn't necessarily to give people more education, unfortunately. The second thing, at the individual level, that I encourage all of you to do is if you ever meet anybody who subscribes to a conspiracy theory that you find really out there, is to meet them with as much empathy as you can. Because we know the number one thing that pushes people further into these groups is being othered and being said, "Look, you're crazy, you're out there, you don't know what you're talking about." It can be very difficult to talk to people who subscribe to some of these theories. I'm not saying it's not. But at an individual level, that is one thing you can do. Meeting people with empathy.
That's part of what the Common Ground Project is designed to do. I don't mean to steal former Premier Prentice's line that it's time for Albertans to look in the mirror. What we're doing through these public opinion polls and focus groups is holding the mirror up to Albertans so that they can see who they actually are versus who they think they are. Hopefully, some of our discussion today has been helpful for you to tell folks there's actually a big disjunction. We're not that province that a lot of us think we are. Thanks.
As a union leader, or potentially a union boss, as some folks in government would call me these days, I would be remiss to not ask, as someone who represents workers, who exactly is the working class these days?
I actually have a second big project focused on social class more generally to really try and answer that question in terms of who the working class is, because it's murky. So we don't exactly know what people think of when they connect things to social class. But in terms of working class, that's one that stands out where we most often see it as connected to occupation, more so than the other class categories, which are connected to income along those lines. So the type of work that people do, and that can be something for people to rally around as well, I think.
There you have it, folks and friends. That's our panel. So a huge thank you and round of applause. Dr. Michelle Maroto, Dr. Feodor Snagovsky, and of course, Dr. Jared Wesley.